Hey everyone, ready to dive into a topic that's been generating a lot of buzz lately?
We're talking about LinkedIn, AI, and what it all means for your data. That's stuff you probably don't think about too much, but is totally a big deal.
So, we found this article from Serenus that really caught our eye. It breaks down how LinkedIn is using platform data, and yeah, we're talking potentially your data to train its AI, for things like those writing suggestions or how posts get recommended to you.
It's all connected.
What?
And to help us unpack all of this, we've got our expert here. Welcome back. For those who might be joining us for the first time, can you give us a little background on your expertise in this whole world of data and AI?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, so my work really centers around data privacy, especially now with AI becoming so integral to how so many companies operate. It's a pretty crucial time to be thinking about these things.
Absolutely. Crucial is a good word for it. So LinkedIn and AI, right?
Yeah.
The Serenus article lays out how they're using all this data for their AI models. But here's what really struck me. Remember that opt-out option they've always had buried in their settings?
Right.
Well, turns out it existed before they even officially updated their policy to mention AI training. Kind of makes you go, did we really know what we were agreeing to?
It's definitely an interesting detail. Legally speaking, it raises questions about transparency and user consent. Did users fully understand how their data was being utilized, especially since that opt-out wasn't explicitly linked to AI training previously?
Exactly. And the thing is, this isn't exactly a news story, is it? We've seen similar things with other big names in tech.
It's true. There's a bit of a pattern emerging, companies using user data in ways that might not be immediately obvious to the average person. And that's where things get a little murky.
Murky indeed. And speaking of murky waters, the article points out how different regions, especially Europe, are starting to take notice of what LinkedIn's doing.
Right.
How does this impact, someone like our listener just trying to navigate this digital world?
So what's interesting is that LinkedIn actually excluded data from their European users when it came to this AI training. And that's all thanks to GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU. It's a really robust set of rules that give individuals more control over their personal data online.
Okay, so break that down for us. How does GDPR actually work in practice?
Well, one of the key things about GDPR is that companies need to get your explicit consent before they can use your data. And that includes using it for things like, you guessed it, AI training.
No more assuming it's okay just because he didn't opt out. They've got to be upfront about it.
Exactly. It shifts the power dynamic a bit, putting more control in the hands of the users.
Which is a pretty different story from how things work for most other people, I'd imagine.
You're right. If you're outside of the EU, your data might not have that same level of protection. So while LinkedIn's adjusting its practices in Europe because of GDPR, those same rules might not apply elsewhere. It creates this kind of two-tiered system depending on your location.
It's almost like a geographical lottery of data rights.
In a way, yes.
So how are other companies handling all of this, especially those big social media platforms? Does the Serenus article mention anything about that?
They do. They quote the Open Rights Group. They're a advocacy group that focuses on digital rights, and they make a really important point.
Okay, I'm listening.
They argue that just relying on users to opt out isn't enough when it comes to true data protection.
Because most people probably don't even realize they need to opt out of something they had no idea was happening in the first place.
Exactly. It's like trying to put a Band-Aid on a problem that most people don't even know exists.
And it puts the onus on the individual to be super vigilant and informed about all these complicated data practices, which, let's be real, who has time for that?
Right. It's not exactly the most user-friendly approach.
So what's the alternative then?
Well, the Open Rights Group suggests that opting in should be the standard.
Meaning you have to actively say, yes, you can use my data for this specific purpose, instead of assuming it's okay unless someone raises their hand and says, wait, hold on a second.
Exactly. It's about making consent more explicit and proactive.
It's interesting because this whole conversation really makes me think about a quote from the Serenus article. You know the one I'm talking about.
The one from Nikki Watson.
Yes, the founder of Cassie.
She said, and I'm paraphrasing here, compliance is good, ethics are better. And I feel like that really resonates with what we're talking about.
Excellent.
It's not just about following the letter of the law, it's about doing what's right by your users, especially when it comes to something as sensitive as their data.
I completely agree.
And that leads us to a really important question. And that question is, what does this all actually mean for the average person using LinkedIn? Let's say, I like to connect with colleagues, maybe browse for some new job opportunities now and then.
How does this whole AI data situation actually impact me?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it goes way beyond just LinkedIn, really. This is a question for the entire tech landscape.
Right. It's bigger than just one company. And the Serenus article even brings up examples of other platforms like Tumblr, Reddit. They're either licensing out user data for AI training or facing a ton of backlash because they weren't upfront with their users about it.
Yeah, it's becoming a real concern. All those photos, messages, posts you share online, it's a gold mine of data for AI training.
It's like AI's dream buffet, and we're all just unknowingly filling up our plates.
Exactly. And we're not always conscious of what we're putting on that plate, are we?
So how do we even begin to find that balance between what we share online and what companies want to do with it, especially with AI becoming more and more prevalent?
That's the million-dollar question we as a society need to figure out, right? We need to have these open, honest discussions about data ownership, transparency, and the potential for exploitation.
Exploitation, how so?
Well, it's about making sure companies aren't prioritizing profit over ethical practices.
Just because they can use our data a certain way doesn't necessarily mean they should.
Precisely. Especially when you're talking about a technology as powerful and potentially game-changing as AI.
So where does that leave someone like me?
Mm.
Or more importantly, our listener, what can we actually do about this?
I think it starts with awareness, becoming more informed about how your data is being used, and then making choices that align with your values. It's like voting with your data, so to speak.
So consciously choosing to support those companies that are upfront, transparent, responsible with our data.
Absolutely. Look for those green flags.
Yeah.
Companies that prioritize transparency, give you genuine control over your data, and go beyond simply checking the legal boxes. They're out there.
It's about more than just following the rules. It's about building trust
Exactly.
and building a better, more ethical digital future for everyone.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
It's like we're talking about two sides of the same coin, right?
On one hand, you've got all this incredible potential with AI, all these ways it can improve our lives.
But then there's this other side, this potential for misuse and exploitation of our data.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's a balancing act for sure.
So let's talk about those potential downsides. What are some of the risks we should be aware of when it comes to our data being used for AI training?
Well, I think privacy is a major concern.
Okay, yeah.
As AI models get more and more sophisticated, they might be able to infer some pretty personal stuff about us from data that seems totally harmless at first glance.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, let's say you're someone who frequently uses a certain health-related search term. An AI model could potentially pick up on that and deduce that you might have a specific medical condition, even if you never actually said anything directly about it.
Wow, that's kind of creepy when you think about it.
Yeah, and that information could then be used to, say, target you with ads for medication or treatments.
Or even worse, it could lead to discrimination.
Exactly. That's why data privacy is so crucial in all of this, especially as AI gets more advanced.
It's like we're almost giving away pieces of ourselves without even realizing it.
Yeah.
And those pieces can be put together to create a picture we never intended to paint.
I like that analogy. It's very true.
So privacy, that's a big one. What else?
Another big concern is bias.
Okay, bias in the sense of.
Well, if an AI model is trained on data that's already biased, which, let's face it, a lot of data is, it can actually perpetuate and even amplify those biases in its outcomes.
So garbage in, garbage out, basically.
Pretty much. So, for example, imagine an AI system being used to help make hiring decisions, right?
Okay, I'm with you.
If that AI was trained on data that showed a historical preference for, say, male candidates in a particular field, it might unintentionally perpetuate that bias.
Wow. So even with the best of intentions, we could end up with AI that's actually reinforcing existing inequalities.
That's the danger. It's not always intentional, but it can have real-world consequences.
It's a lot of responsibility to put on a bunch of algorithms, isn't it?
That's why it's so important to be having these conversations. AI is a powerful tool, and we need to be really thoughtful about how we use it.
We can't just blindly trust the technology.
Exactly. We need to be aware of the potential pitfalls, ask tough questions, and demand better from the companies developing these systems.
So it's about more than just the technology itself. It's about ethics, transparency, accountability.
100%.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. As always, I feel like I've learned so much. But if we had to boil it all down, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with today?
Honestly, I think the biggest takeaway is simply this. Be aware.
Be aware.
Yep, be aware of how your data is being used. Be aware of the potential benefits and risks of AI. And most importantly, be aware that you have a voice in all of this.
We're not just passive bystanders in the age of AI. We have choices to make.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, it's time for us to wrap up another deep dive. A huge thank you to our expert for joining us today and for dropping so much knowledge.
My pleasure, as always.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in and for joining us on this journey of exploration. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive.